There's a photograph that still exists in a private collection in rural Pennsylvania. It was taken in the winter of 1941, outside a farmhouse that no longer stands. In it, you can see a family of 7, all dressed in their Sunday best, standing stiff and unsmiling in the snow. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. The 8th person in that photograph isn't standing with the family. They're in the window behind them. Just a shadow. Just a face. And according to the 3 surviving descendants who've seen this photo, that face didn't belong to anyone living in that house. It belonged to someone the family had hidden for 23 years. Someone they called the forgiven child. Someone they prayed would save them from a curse they believed had followed their bloodline for over 2 centuries. But what they got instead was something far worse than any curse. Something that would fracture that family forever and leave a trail of psychiatric records, police reports, and one very disturbing coroner's file that wouldn't be unsealed until 2009. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of the Morrow family, and this is the story of what happens when shame, superstition, and silence collide in the worst possible way. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not an urban legend. It's documented, it's real, and it's been buried for nearly 80 years, until now. The Morrow family arrived in America in 1763, settling in what would become Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They were God-fearing people, farmers, quiet, the kind of family that kept to themselves and expected the same from their neighbors. But within a single generation, something began to happen that the Morrows couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Every 3rd generation, without fail, a child would be born into the family who was, in the words of period documents, marked by affliction. The descriptions vary depending on which family Bible you read, which crumbling letter you unearth from which attic, but the pattern is undeniable. These children were different, physically, mentally, spiritually different. Some were described as having eyes that wouldn't settle. Others were said to speak in voices that didn't sound like their own. One entry from 1812 describes a boy who knew things no child should know, and who would wake screaming about events that hadn't happened yet but later did. The family believed they were cursed. And more than that, they believed they knew why. In 1791, according to a confession letter written by the family patriarch and discovered in a church archive in 1976, the Morrows had committed what they called an unforgivable sin. The details are vague, deliberately obscured by euphemism and religious language, but the meaning is clear enough. They had betrayed someone vulnerable, someone who trusted them, and in the act of covering up that betrayal, they had, in their own words, invited darkness into the bloodline. For over a century and a half, the Morrows tried everything. They prayed, they fasted, they performed rituals handed down through generations, rituals that had no basis in any recognized faith, but were carried out with desperate conviction. They even tried to breed the curse out, marrying into families they believed were spiritually strong. Nothing worked. Every 3rd generation, like clockwork, the affliction returned. By the early 1900s, the family had developed a grim tradition. When one of these children was born, they were hidden, kept out of public records, homeschooled in isolation, and when they died, often young, often under strange circumstances, they were buried in unmarked graves on family property, far from the town cemetery. The Morrows had learned how to keep secrets. They'd been doing it for generations. But in 1918, something changed. A daughter named Constance Morrow gave birth to a son who seemed, for the first time in anyone's memory, completely normal. Healthy, happy, unremarkable. The family dared to hope. They believed the curse had finally lifted. They called him their forgiven child, a sign that God had, at last, absolved them. They were wrong. His name was Thomas Morrow, born March 16, 1918, in the same farmhouse where 4 generations of Morrows had lived and died. For the first 7 years of his life, he was everything the family had prayed for. He laughed, he played, he helped his father in the fields and sat quietly during Sunday sermons. Neighbors who saw him described him as polite, soft-spoken, almost angelic. The kind of child you'd want your own to grow up beside. But children grow, and sometimes what's hidden inside them grows too. It started small, so small that the family dismissed it as coincidence, as imagination, as the quirks of a sensitive boy. Thomas began talking about the others, not imaginary friends. He was very clear about that. The others, he said, were people who had lived in the house before, people who were still there. He described them in unsettling detail, their names, their faces, the way they died. And when his grandmother checked the family records, her hands shaking, she found that every single person Thomas described had actually existed, and every single one had been born with the affliction. By the time Thomas turned 10, the family couldn't deny it anymore. He wasn't their forgiven child. He was the curse made manifest in a new and terrifying form. Because Thomas wasn't afflicted the way the others had been. He wasn't violent. He wasn't incoherent. He was perfectly lucid, perfectly aware, and that made him so much worse. He began to know things he couldn't possibly know. Private conversations, hidden sins, secrets buried so deep that even the people who'd committed them had tried to forget. He would sit at the dinner table and calmly recount events from 1791, speaking in the cadence and dialect of a man who'd been dead for over a century. His voice would change, his posture would change, and his eyes would go somewhere else entirely. The family was terrified, but they were also trapped. Because by 1928, the world had changed. There were laws now, records, authorities who asked questions. They couldn't simply hide Thomas away like they'd done with the others. People knew he existed. He'd been seen, photographed, documented at the local schoolhouse before his parents pulled him out, claiming illness. So, they made a decision that would haunt the surviving members of that family for the rest of their lives. They would keep Thomas home. They would tell neighbors he was sick, bedridden, too fragile for visitors. And they would wait for him to die, the way the others always had, young, quietly, conveniently. But Thomas didn't die. He got stronger and stranger. And by the time he turned 16, the family realized they weren't living with a sick child. They were living with something that had learned how to wear a child's face. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. And something that had started to enjoy it. By 1934, Thomas Morrow had stopped speaking in his own voice almost entirely. When he did speak, it was in fragments, pieces of people who had lived and died in that house over the span of 2 centuries. His mother, Constance, kept a diary during this period. It was found in a storage unit in 1998, sold off after her death, and eventually donated to a historical society by someone who had no idea what they were reading. The entries are brief, clinical, almost detached, but between the lines, you can feel her unraveling. Thomas stood at my door last night, she wrote in June of 34. He didn't knock, he just stood there. When I asked him what he wanted, he said, "She's asking for you." I said, "Who?" He said, "The one you buried." I haven't buried anyone. I don't know what he means. I'm afraid to ask. The family had turned the attic into Thomas's room. It wasn't a kindness. It was a containment strategy. Up there, he was away from the younger children, his 2 sisters and a brother, all born after him, all terrifyingly normal. Up there, he could pace and mutter and do whatever it was he did in the dark, without the rest of the family having to see it. They brought him meals. They left them outside the door. Sometimes he ate. Sometimes the plate would sit there for days, untouched, and yet Thomas never seemed to weaken, never seemed to need food the way other people did. His father, Benjamin Morrow, tried to involve the church. In 1936, he brought the family pastor to the house under the pretense of giving Thomas communion. The pastor, Reverend Hugh Dalton, was a man who'd served in the First World War and wasn't easily shaken. But, according to a letter he wrote to the diocese, a letter that was never sent but was found in his effects after his suicide, in 1940, the visit left him shattered. "The boy looked at me," Reverend Dalton wrote, "and he smiled. And then he told me the name of the man I killed in France. Not a German soldier, a man from my own unit, a man whose death I reported as enemy fire. Thomas wasn't born when it happened. There's no record, no witness, no possible way he could know, but he knew. And he said, "He forgives you, Hugh, but I don't think God does." Reverend Dalton never returned to the Morrow house. He never spoke of Thomas again. And 6 months later, he walked into the woods behind his church and shot himself. The family stopped trying to get help after that. They stopped talking about Thomas altogether. To the outside world, he simply didn't exist. Birth records were conveniently lost. School documentation vanished. When neighbors asked, the Morrows would say he died of illness years ago, and please don't bring it up, it's too painful. And people believed them, because who would lie about something like that? But Thomas was still there, still in the attic, still watching, still waiting. And by 1941, the year that photograph was taken, the family had begun to realize something even more horrifying than everything that had come before. Thomas wasn't aging. He was 23 years old, but he looked 16, exactly as he'd looked the day they'd locked him in that attic. And when his youngest sister, Ruth, saw him standing in the window that winter day, staring down at the family as they posed for the camera, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever was living in their house wasn't her brother anymore. It was something else, something patient, something that had all the time in the world. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Morrow family lived in a state of silent terror for 7 more years. They adapted. They learned to avoid the attic stairs. They learned not to respond when they heard footsteps above them in the middle of the night, pacing back and forth, in a rhythm that never changed. They learned to ignore the voice that sometimes drifted down through the floorboards, a voice that sounded like Thomas, but also like a dozen other people, all speaking at once, all saying things that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. But in every family, there's always one person who can't live with the silence. One person who needs answers more than they need safety. For the Morrows, that person was Ruth. Ruth was born in 1924, 6 years after Thomas. She was 16 in 1940, old enough to remember when her brother had been normal, and old enough to understand that what her parents were doing, what the whole family was doing, was wrong. Not just morally wrong, supernaturally wrong. She believed, with the fervor of youth, that Thomas could be saved, that he could be reached, that somewhere inside that thing in the attic, her real brother still existed. On the night of November 9th, 1941, while the rest of the family slept, Ruth took a candle and climbed the attic stairs. She later told police, and yes, the police eventually became involved, that she'd prayed for hours before doing it, that she'd asked God to protect her, that she'd truly believed love could break whatever had hold of her brother. She opened the attic door. What happened next comes from Ruth's own testimony, given 3 days later in a psychiatric hospital where she'd been admitted for severe shock and what doctors called dissociative episodes. Her account is fractured, contradictory in places, but certain details remain consistent across every telling, every evaluation, every moment of lucidity she had before her death. In 1987, Thomas was sitting on the floor when she entered, not on the bed the family had given him. On the floor, cross-legged, facing the door, as if he'd been waiting for her. And he was smiling. Ruth said it wasn't a cruel smile. It wasn't menacing. It was almost kind, almost loving, and that made it so much worse. He said, "Hello, Ruth," she told the doctors, but it wasn't his voice. It was our grandmother's voice. She'd been dead for 3 years. And then he said, "You shouldn't have come up here. Now, I have to show you." Ruth couldn't, or wouldn't, describe what Thomas showed her. Every time doctors pressed her on it, she would become hysterical, clawing at her own face, screaming about the chain, and all of them, and what we did to deserve this. The only coherent statement she ever made about that night was this: "He told me everyone who's ever died in this family is still here. They're all still here. And they're all inside him. And they're all awake." The family found Ruth at dawn, unconscious at the bottom of the attic stairs. The attic door was open. The room was empty. Thomas was gone. He was never seen again. The official story, the one that appeared in the Lancaster County Sheriff's reports from November 1941, is brief and frustratingly vague. A 23-year-old man named Thomas Morrow, described as mentally unwell and prone to episodes, had gone missing from his family's farm. A search was conducted. Local volunteers combed the woods and fields for 3 days. They found nothing. No footprints. No clothing. No body. The case was classified as a voluntary disappearance, which was the polite way of saying the authorities believed Thomas had wandered off and died somewhere in the wilderness, and that eventually someone would stumble across his remains. But that's not what the family believed, and it's not what the investigators who looked deeper into this case decades later came to believe either. Benjamin Morrow, Thomas's father, died of a heart attack less than a month after his son's disappearance. He was 49 years old and had been in perfect health. Constance, his widow, sold the farm within 6 months and moved the remaining children to Ohio, where none of them had any connections, any history, any roots. She changed their last name. She burned every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence that Thomas Morrow had ever existed, and she made her children swear on a Bible, on their lives, on the graves of everyone they'd ever loved, that they would never speak his name again. Ruth never recovered. She spent the rest of her life in and out of institutions, convinced that Thomas was still alive, still out there, still watching. In her final interview before her death, conducted by a graduate student researching family trauma in rural America, she said something that didn't make it into the published thesis, but was preserved in the researcher's notes. "He didn't leave," Ruth said. "He's still in the house. He'll always be in the house, because the house is where it started, and that's where it has to end." But here's where it gets stranger and worse. In 2003, a couple from Philadelphia bought the property where the Morrow farmhouse once stood. The house itself had burned down in 1968 under circumstances the fire marshal ruled suspicious but inconclusive. But the land was beautiful, quiet. The couple planned to build their dream home there. They hired a contractor to excavate the foundation. What they found, buried 6 feet beneath where the attic had been, were human remains. 7 sets of remains, to be exact, all children, all between the ages of 8 and 16. All showing signs of what the forensic anthropologist called pre-mortem confinement, meaning they'd been kept somewhere small, somewhere dark, somewhere they couldn't escape. The remains dated